beginning of a day, as it is here in England, to start off a conversation by talking about the hellish, how, and sorcerers, witchcraft, and such. But the problem is, more and more you see on the news, and you find yourself having the view that we are now living in a form of hell. Now, hell can be a literal place, or hell can be like hell on earth, a hell of a place now this world has become. And frequently we're bombarded by what you might call the goad sticks of fear as coming from the hellish. Now, hell, you would say, is for the hellish, and heaven is for the heavenly. Now, when you look into that place called hell, right, hell, take out all of the things you've ever heard about hell to various degrees and the religious connotations to that word and everything else, and you're left with the view really that there is such a place in another dimension called hell, simply labelled as hell, but also called a lake of fire, a place where worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched, and all of these things come up in relation with the word hell, and hell being largely for the hellish, and also with the word hell comes up the word torment. Time and time again you see the word torment in association with hell, and the symbolic reference to hell as being a place where worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched, and also in reference to the place called hell, you have this view of a place called Gehenna that people have summed up as being hell, where the place called Gehenna, we're told, was a place like a rubbish tip outside the city where they would burn up all the rubbish, right, and everything else, like they used to do, or much like they do now. You have a rubbish tip, basically. But on that rubbish tip, they would sometimes have criminals thrown on that rubbish tip. And the best way to eliminate rubbish is to burn it. So places like Gehenna would be constantly on fire and burning. And in association with that rubbish tip, you'd often see a criminal, let's say, half eaten by worms. So one view and summary of that place and how is a form of rubbish tip where the fire never goes out, because rubbish tips are huge sometimes, and if they're on fire, well, they don't go out because they burn the rubbish. And where worms tend to eat bodies and all the rubbish and all the garbage. So one view of that awful place called hell, looking at this somewhat symbolically, is the view of the rubbish tip with criminals on that rubbish tip, half eaten by worms and perhaps half burnt at the other end by the eternal fires of Gehenna that never go out, seeing as it's a rubbish tip and the rubbish tip is always melting up, and therefore the fires never go out. So that is a summary of hell being like a rubbish tip where you burn garbage and criminals ending up on that rubbish tip, half eaten by worms. And so hell is summed up as a place where worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched. In other words, the fire never goes out and the worms keep eating. So a very awful place to find yourself looking at hell symbolically. Now, if you look at hell as a neighbourhood, now who might be your next door neighbour in hell? Well, you have a list of all of the people that end up in this awful place called hell. And it really does sum up the most hellish of people who end up in that place called hell. Now, there are two in particular. If you want to look at how as a neighbourhood, then check out your neighbours here in the book of Revelation. That you got to remember, the book of Revelation really is the extremes of human nature in the last days. Now, the thing is, we are living in the last days. Now, the extremes of human nature will be in the last days. And so, if you want to have a summary of the hellish, then look into the book of Revelation. You'll have many references to hellish people in the extreme. Now, hell really is a place really largely for the most extreme criminals, you would say, of man. And hell being largely for the hellish. And so here's a list of let's view hell now as more as a neighbourhood, with the symbolic reference to the lake of fire burning with brimstone, or the symbolic reference of hell being like a rubbish tip, where you throw all the garbage, and including the garbage of society being criminals, half burnt and half eaten by worms that never seem to die. I guess if you were walking around in the days where a place called Gehenna was out there outside the city, and you went past that place, it would be quite common to see a criminal maybe burn one end, and the other end the worm still eating the feet or the head or wherever, the arms. So a place where worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. Or you could see hell as a place called it's a lake of fire, burning with brimstone. Well, if you look up brimstone, then brimstone is much like sulphur, they say, so it gives off awful fumes. So imagine you picture them, right? So I'm in a lake of fire burning with brimstone. So it's a lake you can't get out of. There's no land. You're stuck in that lake. It's burning, a lake of fire, burning with brimstone, where brimstone gives off awful fumes. So you're beaten either way. You maybe you swim around in this lake you picture. Looking at this symbolically, you're stuck in this lake. It's a place where worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. So you picture pictures there that I am that worm, because the lake of fire is not quite like a rubbish tip, is it? And should I find myself in a place where worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched, and that place is called a lake of fire, then I kind of picture myself being that worm. And the lake of fire never goes out, a fire that cannot be quenched. And then there's these awful fumes coming from brimstone, gives off fumes. And brimstone, when it burns, becomes kind of gooey and therefore clings to your body. So quite an awful symbolic reference to the place called hell. That more looking at this symbolically. But if you look at the neighbourhood of hell and why it would end up a place of torment and symbolically viewed as a lake of fire or Gehenna, a rubbish tip and everything else where you burn criminals, then you get more insight into this place called hell, hell being for the most hellish. Now, in this world today, we frequently see on the news this present crisis that we're in, and we indeed are subject to much torment. Torment in that it doesn't look like there's a way out of this crisis. We're told there's a way out, but the way out doesn't look very heavenly, does it now? Now on here you have to be careful what you say, or they block your